There it goes.
Scott, it's really good to see you again.
Good to see you.
You had a question about the five uh, pictures that you put on the Skype, where middle one is where everybody normally thinks of what enlightenment make me with everything. Okay?
Mm,
But that is actually a perception.
mm.
I am one with everything. That's a thought.
Right.
It's actually being one with everything. It's
Yeah.
so this teaching of Paticca Samuppada is deeply, deeply related to the jhanas in the sense that in order to experience these items on uh, Paticca Samuppada, the mind must be in a state or condition that it can see that stuff directly, rather than having it as a list of items that you would put down as an answer to some test or something.
Yeah.
See, that's what's happened with much of Buddhism, taking it as a subject of information, and we treat it like any other school topic, and we turn it into a conceptualization. So perceive and perceive and conceptualize Paticca Samuppada, and then we also perceive and conceptualize the jhanas.
Mm.
Where the reality is that the state of the jhana is when one is in that state, then that means that they're a particular place in the Paticca Samuppada. And so the first jhana would be the point where we are being able to actually control the feelings, because we have sukha and piti in the first jhana. So we've already learned to control the feelings, and this is what we mean by wisdom at the contact. But the reality is that we've already started making some changes to the salāyatana, that we're already beginning to perceive things differently, because the salāyatana has that gladdening of the mind, the language that we use to brighten things up. Okay. And as we then progress through the jhanas, we get more and more intense at that point of feeling for the second jhana and then the third jhana. But when the fourth jhana comes, we start then looking at the deeper things that are there in the sense of the relationship between our actual sensory input and what we do with it. Okay. So the first three jhanas have to do with what we do with it. And then the fourth jhana has various aspects that help us figure out how to stop doing what we are doing. Now, in the beginning, the ordinary person, the things that we are doing wind us up ignorantly in tanha, upadana, um, bhava, jati, and dukkha. So those things happen when we are in the ordinary state, but when we're in the first jhana, that means that we can guard enough of that sensory, let us say sensory output. Talking about sensory input, the sensory output is actually the salāyatana, or the sense that we make out of things. Now, this is actually quite confusing for a lot of students, and so let's get that a little bit cleared up, and I'll use the word seeing, like I see with the eyes, which means that colors, shapes, forms, and movements come in through the eyes. But then I can say something like, I see a tree, or even more specifically, I see what you mean. Now, I see what you mean means that now, hopefully, our conceptualized language is in sync, because I actually see, or I perceive, or I have the same um, concept that you do. So I see what you mean. We're engaged or in line with each other, and that's at the point of salāyatana. So actually, we have two different kinds of consciousness. We have the raw input consciousness and then the processed consciousness. Okay. The processed consciousness, then, think about it like a hard drive that has been partitioned, so you know the size of it. But there's two different states that a partition can be in. One is raw, and the other one is formatted.
Mhm.
And if it is formatted, that means that now we can use it to store data. Okay, so what we're actually doing here with this concept language is to remove the formatting and leave the drive raw. It's empty, which means that we don't hang on or store or cling to any of the sensory input. We just allow it to come. Now, in continuing with the data processing concept, that if you've got a program that is processing the data. Now, in the old equipment before computers came along, they had things called unit record equipment that did all the accounting work. The unit record equipment, a unit record, by the way, is a punched card, a hollerith punched card. Perhaps you've seen them. They're in the archives. Sometimes they're in.
Yeah, I
That
know.
in fact, the hollerith punch card was the actual size of the greenback dollar of the 1890s. The dollars that we have now are a little bit smaller. But the
Okay.
greenback dollar was the format for the hollerith card. The point that I'm making is that the data is punched as punched holes in the card.
Right.
When the card goes into the machine, as it's being inputted, because of the cycling, that when the card has a hole in it, there's a contact made. That contact may be hardwired through a punch board that looks very similar to the old. You've seen telephone systems where the operator is saying, "May I have your number, please?" And then she'll take a cord and she'll plug it into various places to make the contacts. Okay. So we have that with the punch card, so that when that punch card hole has a contact, that can either go to an adder or it can go to a print head. But the timing of it has to do then with when that bail is set up and stopped, so that at the end of the cycle, all of the bales are in the row, and then the hammers come and go a big whack, and that'll print a line. Okay. So the point that I'm making is that those kind of machines did very, very little processing. So the speed of the input card is the processing speed. The machine has to be that way so that by the time the card is read, it's either calculated or printed. Right? If it's a calculation, then it has to run through another print cycle to get the bale set up for the numbers. That's why it will sound like a chung, because the first ka is the setting up of the alphabet, and then the chung is when the numbers are set up. Okay, very little processing. Now in modern computers, we have it set up so that a piece of information is either taken off of a CD or off of a flash drive or off of a hard drive or off of the internet. And then that data has to be processed, has to be calculated up. And then later it's got to be set up for a printer, because modern printers don't have that very simplicity. Now they have to calculate which dot is going to be printed and all of that kind of stuff. And so what that means is that the ability for the computer to read data at full speed is hindered by the processing of the data. So you read and you process, you read and you process it, you read and you process. This is the way that the human mind is going. Okay, so what we're now learning to do is do more reading and less processing.
Mm.
And as we are doing more reading and less processing, that means that the amount of information that can come in becomes huge. That while we're looking for understanding, we'll pinpoint something, we'll listen to it. We talked about the sound a moment ago. If I have the sound and identify that as the oboe, while I'm doing that, I'm going to be missing everything else the orchestra is doing right then in that second. Because now I've got oboe on my mind rather than the sound of
Right.
the orchestra on my mind.
Right.
Okay, so this is
That, yeah.
the whole idea of it then is that we can either gain data and then process it. We can either process it wisely or process it ignorantly. But what we're learning to do is to see that processing and then beginning to bring it to a halt so that we allow just raw data input. Okay, so that means that we have very, very little salāyatana and a whole lot of viññana, which is actually, these are the two kinds of consciousness. Philosophers and psychologists, they look at consciousness as that which we perceive. The Buddha is saying, no, consciousness is the ability to take in input, not the ability to process it for understanding.
Hmm.
That there's that stages in there from the input through the processing. Now the processing requires old data. That's where the salāyatana comes in for ordinary people. Go ahead.
Wait, can you clarify? So the Buddha defines consciousness as the processing or the input?
The input itself, the
The input
ability to
itself.
take. Mhm. That's why they call it eye consciousness, because it's the data that comes into the eye. Or
Right.
ear consciousness or sound consciousness because of
Uh-huh.
the data that comes into the ear.
Uh-huh.
Or the touch consciousness because of the data that comes into and contacts the body.
Okay.
All right. So that is the real consciousness that the Buddha talks about. And then after it's processed, that's the kind of consciousness that we say, oh, I see what you mean. That is a kind of consciousness, but
Mm-hmm.
it is manufactured inside the human existence
Mm-hmm.
to where real consciousness is the consciousness that comes in through the sensory system.
Right, because I was kind of confused about consciousness because I came from an Advaita tradition, or like I mainly studied that or practiced like non-dual uh, Hindu type of uh, traditions where consciousness is the awareness of the input. So that's the way it's seen, is that um, it's the receiver of input, that's
Okay.
consciousness, and it's some kind of permanent ground. So there's kind of like a self identification with that, but that's all the way down the road, as we're talking about, of the dependent origination.
Mm-hmm.
um that now that the self is constructed, it identifies as something, some kind of awareness.
All right, let's use this example. The example is that an apple tree is ripe with apples and apples are falling. Okay, so that's the
Okay.
conceptualized setup. Okay, as the observer sees the object falling, that's all there is. But what humans do with that, and they will say, oh, that is an apple that fell, and I want that apple. So we actually go and pick up that apple and put it into our basket and claim it to be mine. Okay, that's the whole process of Paticca Samuppada right there. This is my apple, right? That's where the selfishness comes in. And it came in because we wanted the apple, because we liked the apple, because we recognized that it was an apple that fell. So if we back up to the point of just seeing it, and I use the word it now because it's unidentified yet, when we see just falling, we see it fall, and that's all there is to it. that means then that we can continue to look and see other fruit trees with other apples falling, and we can see, I saw that also. I saw falling, I saw falling, I saw falling, I saw falling. And that's all that there is, except that the I saw falling. We could better just say seeing, 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 seeing. And that's all there is. If we say falling, then that's actually a kind of perception. And then apple falling is more perception, more salāyatana. And that when the apple, and we recognize that it's an apple that fell, that's what contacts us, not just seeing. So we now say, I see an apple falling, and that is what contacts us. And so that's where the feeling comes from. I like apples. I want that apple that fell. Okay, so this is now the progression of paticca samuppada. But if we can leave it at just seeing, then that means that we brought an end to perception and feelings. There's nothing to feel because we're not perceiving anything. We're not being contacted in any way. We're just seeing. So at that level, that would be that fifth one. Okay, so that middle one of make me one with everything means that I perceive everything, including me, and I am a part of everything. That still has that self
Right.
in it,
Right.
perception. But it's a major, major step forward.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
Because
That's
that
better
first
than-
picture is where most people are.
Yeah.
That first picture is where we, in the picture, the guy standing there sees a bird, but now
Right.
he's got to process it as bird. He's got to process it as sound. I hear the bird sing. And that's why there is separation. I am here and the bird is there.
Mhm.
But if we just hear a sound without even identifying it as a bird, because if we identify it as a bird, then we might want the bird. If we just hear it as a sound, then that's leaving it at that level of sanya, of viññana, and not going to the salāyatana, not going as far as I know what that is. Now, this is an important thing about the idea that we can, in fact, receive so much more input if we're not processing the input that we do receive.
Now it's
This
strange.
is where we get the idea of a flood.
Hmm.
The
Now it's
flood
strange.
is these. Go ahead.
It's I know the experience you're talking about, and it's such a weird, like, subtlety that how could you possibly intend to experience like that, because already you've processed it if you're trying to experience it. So it's a weird thing, like, it's so weird, but you can't, but somehow it happens. But it's like it's hard to make sense of it because you, it's hard to practice it,
It
I guess. It's kind of
actually, another way of saying it is that it requires a skill. And that
skill.
skill is what we're developing. And we're developing several skills that help us to do that. And
Right.
without skills, um, just like sawing wood, you've got a piece of wood and you've got a saw, and you may be able to saw that piece of wood, but you can't make furniture out of that because you don't have the skills of measuring, you don't have the skills of seeing any of the stuff about what's going on. And so this is where we need to build the skills. And the important way to look at this is that most of the skills that we need to be able to do this are the skills of first jhana.
Right.
The skills that we need are built in first jhana, and that the important skill is not that we can momentarily pay attention to the sensory input, It's that can we persist with that a while? So the ability to sustain the fourth jhana is the same skill that we're developing of being able to sustain wholesome thoughts in the first jhana. If we can think of and have one wholesome thought after another wholesome thought after another wholesome thought, then we begin to put some gaps in there. But when we do put gaps in there, there's still a whole lot of feeling left.
Is there is the first four jhanas sufficient, or do you need, or is it better to like develop the skill of going past the fourth jhana to the formless jhanas? You don't need to do that.
No. Now you're getting way off of stuff. I'm not, in fact, we could call that part of it the Hinduism that was added to Buddhism.
Oh, so you don't teach those at all?
No, no. What we talk instead is that there are really only four jhanas. And the question is, if you can get into the fourth jhana and sustain it, what are you going to do with it?
Oh.
Okay, that in fact, in some suttas, if you list it that way, then you could say that there are 9 jhanas.
Okay.
Okay, you probably heard these things before. One would be infinite. Gosh, I've got to have that word in there.
Infinite consciousness, infinite
But it's
space, and
right. Guess what? Let's start it first at that point. In the time of the Buddha, there was no concept of infinite. It did not exist. That infinite, in fact, is a mathematical concept. And the reality is things just keep going on and on and on, and there's no end to it. But infinite is a concept that does not really exist. There is nothing in the universe aside from mathematics. There is nothing in the universe that is actually infinite. Everything is finite. The amount of energy in the universe is finite. The age of the universe is finite. The number of stars in the universe is finite. The size of the universe is finite. The number of grains of sand on the beach is vast and uncountable, but not infinite.
okay.
If the grains of sand upon the beaches was infinite, then not only would the earth, and there would be no room for water because it would be all sand. There would be no room for the space between Jupiter and Mars because it would be all sand. The whole universe would be nothing but sand, and even the universe itself is not big enough to have all the sand. That would be an infinite amount of sand. It's a concept that does not exist in reality. Now, Bhikkhu Bodhi should have understood that much about mathematics when he chose the word infinite, because the real word that we're looking for is the word boundless.
Boundless, yes. I've heard that too.
Okay, because this is really what's going on. When we talk about infinite space, what we're talking about really is, where is the boundary between your skin and the air? Is there actually a boundary there? The answer is, upon close inspection, there is no boundary, not a hard, fixed boundary. Ordinary people think there are, but then what about the hair on your arm? Does the hair on your arm go into the air? Does the hair on your arm go into your arm? Then where's the end of you, and where's the end of the hair, and where does the air begin? The answer to that is some of that air is already inside the skin anyway. There is no real cut, hard boundary there. No boundaries. That we are a part of it. That in fact, when you're breathing, where is the boundary between the air and the body? Because the body is breathing in and out is part of the air. And so this idea of infinite space means the space that we're in has no real boundaries to it. Now, the boundaries of consciousness, though, is the boundary between the actual sense input and your perceiving. We stopped we put a boundary in there because we stopped taking data long enough to try to figure out what it was that we saw. Okay. And so one of the, we've covered two of them now. One is infinite space and infinite consciousness, which is basically just the boundaries don't exist. There really are no boundaries. When we come to understand there are no boundaries, that's when the Dalai Lama becomes one with everything, because he's removed the boundaries. That is an element of the fourth jhana. And we could sit and muse and see that temporarily, momentarily.
Right. Okay, so these are like elements of the fourth jhana. That
Mhm.
okay.
These are aspects.
Yeah. Okay, that makes more sense to me. So, because like I've experienced, because like I was expecting it to be like another fourth jhana, just how like first jhana is like first jhana, and second jhana is like second jhana, and then third jhana is like third jhana, and fourth jhana is like fourth jhana. But then these other like boundlessness and stuff, it's kind of just like a temporary little, it's like a thing, but like it comes out of the equanimity, or the
When,
total
when the
equanimity.
right, when the
Yeah.
mind is sharp and
Right.
stable,
Right.
then we can hear those things, like the sound. We can hear the sound of the whole orchestra. We
Right.
could not possibly reproduce it in our head, but we can hear it all.
Right.
Okay. But if we start labeling it, oh, that's an oboe, and that's a French horn, and that's a violin, we are now really limiting what the sensory input. When we hear the violin and identify it as a violin, we're not listening to the bass. That's the whole point is that we have selective perception. And by selecting out the input that we're using, that limits us because of our selection process.
And something you said, going back to the teacher Samapada, something you said in last night's Sangha made, so if you can catch things at the point of liking them, so before it becomes craving, just I like this. Why do I like this? Um, you can kind of stop it in its tracks, right? You can stop it
Mhm.
like because the
Exactly so, because when you're asking that question, why do I like it? You're actually now doing a bit of investigation of your perceptual system.
right, your perceptual system.
Mhm. And the perceptual system has
Like
that past in it. I like it because I am used to that. It's familiar to me.
uh,
That we like things because they are familiar to us.
but that's like a conceptual frame of it, but I'm talking about seeing like the experience of liking something, like seeing the mechanism of I like this, and like seeing it and you're like, what is that? Uh Rather than going into the past of like, why do I like this? Just like seeing the mechanism of liking something and like catching it there. And then you could see that it's just a sensation that's like
Mhm.
not, it's like, it's another input. Like even the liking something is like information before you
Yes,
process it into more stuff. Right.
precisely so.
Yeah.
Exactly. Um, the sequence of events that are listed in the 12 steps of dependent origination, uh, it seems very complicated to people until they've realized really what's going on. And when they do that, they'll say, wait a minute, the water of Paticca Samuppada does not flow completely straight down, that there are eddies and circles and
Yeah.
things in there that make
Right.
things kind of move around. That, yes, once you see um, that you like it, that's a a new consciousness that brings up a new perception. But if
Mm,
we don't do that, then if we just like it ignorantly and are not doing that extra processing, not forming that eddy to see what's going on, then that feeling of liking will
right.
go immediately into I
Yeah.
want it.
Yeah.
And so going back to that point about the various parts of it now, is that we've looked at two of them. Another one to look at is the one that's called neither perception nor non-perception. This is actually beginning to understand the boundary between perception and consciousness. In other words, you have to have a little bit of perception to perceive consciousness itself. You can't have zero, because if
Right.
there is zero perception, then we're not actually receiving the data as strict input.
Right.
So there's a very tiny, tiny little bit of perception in there. And in the Visuddhimagga, they give the example of that as a clay bowl that, like an oil lamp, but a clay bowl that has had oil in it, and you've drained all the oil out. Even though there is no oil that you can, let us say, remove, you can actually take a cloth and work around the bowl and get that cloth oily a little bit. You could
Mm,
do that over and over again, and pretty soon there's very little or no oil coming off of the inside of the bowl as oil onto the cloth, but you still know that there is oil in the bowl.
mhm.
The oil is there inside the bowl, inside mixed with the clay itself. There is no way to get the all of the oil back out of the bowl.
Mm,
Some of the oil stays in the bowl. Okay, so in that regard, that means that we need just a tiny little bit of perception in order to be able to receive data consciously. This is the state of nothing, of neither perception or non-perception, but they can go a little bit further in the sense of when there is no perception at all, then the consciousness and the sensory input doesn't happen very well at all. And this is what we mean by the state of nothingness. There is nothing there because the consciousness is not having enough perception to even be able to perceive the consciousness. So these are some of the items on that list of infinite space, infinite consciousness, when we know that it's not infinite, it's just the boundaries are getting loose. So the boundary between consciousness and perception is a very, very interesting place. This, when the mind is really, really sharp, you can begin to see that there is that boundary between the perception, and we're going to begin to remove that boundary so that we can just see the sensory input. Okay. When we can bring the perception to an end, that means that there is no salāyatana to impact us, to give feelings. This is then of the state of uh, equanimity or upekkha, is the state of nothingness because there's no feelings left. There's no feelings left because there is no perception left. And all there is just raw input of data, just raw input. So we're not taking what that input is, the reality, the rupa, and naming it,
mhm.
or bringing it to a state of understanding. We're doing less and less of that. And when there is no perception left, there is no naming left, then there is no contact left. And when there is no contact left, there is nothing to rise feelings. And so the feelings go into a state of uh, not really there. And that this in the sutra number 111, in the one by one as they occur, this is where Buddha and Sariputta recognize that's the end of the practice. There's nothing left
Yeah.
to um, uh, the business of the Dhamma or anything else when we can bring our feelings to a stop And we bring the feelings to a stop by bringing perception to a stop. That there's nothing left. There's nothing.
That's it.
That's it. That's as far as we can go.
It's kind of cool.
Mhm. But it's still temporary. No one stays in
Right.
that state.
Yeah, definitely. It's
No
temporary.
one stays in that
Yeah.
state. Everything is then temporary, but when you come back out, you come back with a kind of with the sense of relief. Wow, that's just all there is to it.
Yeah.
But that sense of relief is only happening when it starts back up because you have now seen it right to the very end.
Mm.
The only thing that's even more peaceful than that is death itself.
Yeah, just dying. So, it'll happen eventually.
Mhm. So this is what they are talking about, and that picture that you had, those 5 things actually are. It looks very, very Zen, the way that it's
Mm.
done with the Zen drawing and all of that kind of stuff. And many of the Theravadas will say, well, wait a minute, Zen is missing so much of the data. It's missing. I mean, they didn't even have the suttas, but this
Right.
picture shows, yes, they do understand. These pictures are
No,
actually a
it's a
pictorial
Theravada.
representation of the 4th jhana.
I don't think those pictures come from a Zen person. It's not from Zen. I think it like stylistically might look like that, but
Oh,
I think
okay.
yeah, it's about I think it's about this it's more Theravada if anything. I don't know.
Whoever
I'm not.
did those pictures, they actually knew what they were doing, though.
Yeah, yeah,
That's
yeah,
brilliant.
for
I have
sure.
not seen
Yeah.
those pictures before, but when I did, I say, that's that's it.
Yes. Yeah.
A
Someone.
picture is worth 1,000 words. Here I spent 37 minutes or 40 minutes talking about it with all of these words and those 5
It's a good
photos.
picture.
It's a good picture.
Yeah. 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 No, I got it from another pretty popular Dhamma practitioner who uh he was influenced by Daniel Ingram, and then he
Mhm.
went through all the path attainments, and he makes a lot of videos and like has a lot of good stuff out there, and he like shared that, so it was a pretty good find indeed.
Well, the the Western mentality is that this stuff is really, really hard to do.
Hmm.
But the reality is that no, it's just a matter of skills. And very
Right.
few people develop the skills that they need to
Right.
do. But these skills are available to anyone. If they practice these skills, they would be able to take the mind into these states.
Yes.
But then it's all temporary. That the one that we want to really practice and stay with and put a lot of time in, not just putting a lot of time in practicing trying to do it, but spending a lot of time in 1st jhana to be able to apply the mind and sustain the mind and apply the mind and sustain the mind in the wholesome.
Because that's what calms you down. Calms you
Mhm.
starts to like calm you down enough to see,
To
you know,
see clearly, to see
yeah, see
better.
clear.
Okay.
Yeah.
And as we do that, and as we get more and more calm, we begin to calm the mind down to where the actual thoughts stop. But we talk about there's a problem with the word thought. This is why I tend to go into the idea of a mind moment. How do you spend the mind moment? Because a mind moment can be spent in discursive thought.
Mm.
It can be spent as an argument. It can also be spent as observation. And then when
Mm.
we are spending our time in observation only, that's the 4th jhana. And
Mm,
everybody moves in and out of this, just like anyone. The first jhana would be described as being able to read. Most
right.
people say they can read, and when they find something interesting to read, they'll start reading. But after the first paragraph or so, they're spending more time thinking about what they just read than the further reading. And so now the eyes are following along with the words, but we're not picking up that data. We're
Right.
remembering and talking to ourselves about what used to be there. And so the first jhana is being able to read and read and read. And at the end of the sentence, you know that you got that sentence. At the end of the paragraph, you know you got that paragraph. Okay.
Yeah, this is why the uh uh listening to you and like the way you talk about it, uh before then the jhana was like some kind of mystical like experience, like idea of a mystical experience. And yeah, it's like that's probably how most people see it. It's like some sort of
Uh,
mystical.
but they're
Yeah.
not even taking that mystical experience apart. It's almost when we say mystical experience, that means that we cannot dissect that either.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
Okay, that this is where religion comes in, that it's
Right.
indescribable because we haven't done the evaluation yet.
You just say, "Oh, it's God." It's give up.
Yeah, it's God, or it's
Yeah.
a miracle, or
Yeah.
it's this or something like that. And that's what makes it magical for most
Yeah.
people,
Yeah.
other than a level of skill. The same exact same thing is done with prestidigitation or magic tricks, that you
What's
have to be able to
prestidigitation?
practice what you're doing over and over
Uh,
again so that you can get your hands just right. So that for instance, the example would be of doing something with bottle caps, and you have to kind of convince the person that's with you that you've only got one bottle cap because you're holding the other bottle cap in your hand like this with your finger. And so you can put that one bottle cap on the top of the hand and then turn the hand over, and that bottle cap lands on the tip of the finger because it was actually glued to the one that was inside. And you bring that up while you catch the one in the ear in your hand here, and they think that the bottle cap was able to magically land on the tip of your finger, when in fact it was glued. It was already glued
mhm.
there.
Yeah.
Okay, so um, we begin to realize then that everything is real.
Mm.
That just because we didn't see what happened didn't mean that it was magical.
Right. Okay.
Seeing through prestidigitation is, in fact, one of the remarkable awakenings that we have. And then we can recognize, oh, it's not magic, it's a skill.
Mm.
It's a skill that we develop. All of these magic tricks with all of these cards are simply because the guy just spent a lot of time with cards, flipping them and turning them and buying, let us say, 52 packs of cards so he can get 52 seven of hearts. So he can play seven of heart tricks, but he's got a whole deck of cards, but there's nothing but seven of hearts in there. And so when he spreads that deck out in front of somebody, it's actually a different deck that he's showing them. And then he takes that deck and say, okay, this has got all the 52 cards. There's no magic here. And then he puts that deck down and picks up the deck, and you don't see him do that. And this deck has only got 52 seven of hearts in it. And so naturally, he can shuffle and pliddle and do all kinds of things and tap and say, okay, you choose the card, and here it comes, seven of hearts. How can that possibly be? The answer to that is because you pulled it out of a deck that only had seven of hearts in it.
Mhm.
Okay, that's the magic trick that we have, and we have to recognize that there is no real
Yeah.
magic.
That's the magic.
There is only let us say, lack of perception. We didn't see what happened. And so now we're going to take that as information to recognize we need to look really closely. We need to see what's really going on inside the mind, because the mind doesn't come up with magical seven of hearts either. that we rigged our own deck, and we didn't
Yeah.
even know we'd rigged our own deck.
It's like, oh, I like this, and then it turns out bad. I'm like, oh, why am I suffering now? Well,
Yeah, why
that's
am I
it was
suffering? Right, and the answer is we don't have the skills to see what we did. And so the whole teaching of Paticca Samuppada, the whole teaching of Anapanasati is to teach us to really look at what we're doing so that we wind up not being confused, that we could see what's going on, that we see that our feelings come from our perceptions. They don't come from any place else. And they come, normally the feelings come from not perceiving things the way that they really are. That we've added something to it out of our past. And so how we begin to practice is by beginning to control your feelings. If you can control the feelings, then you can begin to feel the way that you want to. This is first jhana, is to being able to control the feelings, because if you can see that you can control the feelings, then you can unravel the mechanism that brings about these feelings. That's the perception. How do we perceive things is the base of our feelings, not what really happened.
Wow. All I can say is wow.
Well, that's exactly what those 5 images are pointing out.
Yeah.
And there is a stage where we have to be at one with the universe. I actually recommend that. Why? Because that means that we're spending a lot of time in sensory input. We're taking in data. The only confusion we're having is that there is a me there that's taking in data. But we could come to that conclusion also and recognize, no, it's just data.
Yeah.
I'm part of the data if there's a me.
Yeah, and especially when you're really, really deep in dukkha, the witness stage is kind of like a nice little like life raft to hold on to. Like, oh, I'm not my dukkha, I'm the awareness of the dukkha. So it's kind of like a witness stage where it's like, but that's not even close to even the being one with everything, which isn't, yeah.
But that's why this is a sequence of events.
Yeah.
We have to go through those skill developments.
Yeah.
And as we develop the skills, we can recognize that there is only consciousness. There is no self in that consciousness, nor even the idea that I am at one with the universe. That's still a conceptualized perspective, rather than just merely being in sensory input.
And even the consciousness is impermanent too.
Everything is temporary. Everything is impermanent. Nothing stays the same.
Right, and that's the problem. I think in some non-dual insight or traditions, you get to everything as consciousness, but now you latch on to consciousness. Now you you take ownership of consciousness, and then that leads to dukkha, and then people wonder why, like it, and then now you're in a state of denial about not having any dukkha because you've seen that everything is consciousness. But the only problem is that you're attached to the consciousness.
Mm-hmm. And so the answer to that will, never mind, start again.
Right.
Just keep coming back to it.
Oh, it's beautiful. It's been a good talk.
I'm really pleased with your progress, Scott. I'm pleased. I get a great deal of joy out of it.
I can't thank you enough. And all the teachers before you and the Buddha, the whole
right.
Yeah.
Gratitude, that's good stuff.
Feeling
grateful.
Warms you up.
Yeah. All right, Scott. Well, we'll see you later. This has been a
All
great
right.
talk. I've really enjoyed this.
All right. See ya.